400 meters below the summit of Everest, inside snow samples collected at an altitude where human cells begin dying within hours, scientists found plastic. Not metaphorical plastic, not symbolic plastic, actual synthetic fibers, smaller than a grain of rice, embedded in snow that most people assume is the purest substance left on the planet. That was 2019. The same expedition drilled an ice core at 8,020 meters above sea level, the highest ice core ever extracted anywhere on Earth, and discovered that the frozen archive inside was vanishing. Centuries of climate data, thinning and disappearing in real time. But Everest is only the beginning, because Nepal holds discoveries that most people have never heard of. In caves carved into cliffs 4 kilometers above sea level, archaeologists found mummies, painted coffins, and gold funeral masks. Beneath ordinary rice paddies in the southern lowlands, instruments revealed the buried streets of an entire fortified city. When an earthquake destroyed one of Kathmandu's most famous monuments, the rubble exposed foundations that turned out to be 5 centuries older than any written record, and stronger than the building that collapsed above them. In a remote valley in the far west, the ruins of a forgotten Himalayan capital still preserve monolithic stone pillars, palace walls, and an underground water system made of clay pipes. And in the sediments of the Himalayan foothills, a single tooth rewrote the map of where large-bodied apes lived 9 million years ago. Nepal is almost always framed through the same handful of images: Everest, prayer flags, monasteries clinging to mountainsides. But some of the most extraordinary discoveries ever made in Asia are hidden inside this country. Buried in ice, sealed in caves, folded into earthquake rubble, locked beneath fields, carved into forgotten valleys, and embedded in ancient rock. This is what they found. Start at the top. In the spring of 2019, a multidisciplinary expedition organized by the National Geographic Society and Tribhuvan University set out for the highest reaches of Everest's Nepalese side. The team included glaciologists, climate scientists, biologists, and a support crew willing to operate scientific instruments in conditions that would kill an unacclimatized person in a matter of hours. Their primary target was the South Col Glacier, sitting at roughly 8,020 meters, deep inside what climbers call the death zone. Above approximately 7,600 meters, the human body cannot acclimatize. Cells deteriorate, cognition slows. Every additional hour spent at that altitude is borrowed time. Now imagine, in that environment, setting up a drill. Not a handheld tool, a coring apparatus capable of extracting a continuous cylinder of compressed ice and snow from the glacier's interior, preserving its layered structure so that each band of frozen material can later be analyzed in a laboratory thousands of kilometers away. The logistics alone are staggering. Equipment had to be carried by hand through the icefall, across crevasse fields, and up exposed ridgelines where winds regularly exceed 100 kilometers per hour. Batteries drain faster in extreme cold. Metal components become brittle. The researchers themselves were working at the edge of what the human body can tolerate. They succeeded. The core they extracted from the South Col became the highest elevation ice core ever collected on Earth. And here is why that matters. An ice core works like a frozen diary. As snow falls on a glacier, it traps tiny bubbles of air, particles of dust, traces of atmospheric chemistry, pollen, volcanic ash, and other materials. Over time, each season's snowfall is compressed into a distinct layer. Read from top to bottom, the core becomes a chronological record, a vertical archive of environmental conditions stretching back years, decades, sometimes centuries or millennia. High-altitude ice cores are especially valuable because they sample the upper atmosphere more directly than low-elevation glaciers. The South Col sits so far above the surrounding landscape that its ice preserves signals from atmospheric circulation patterns that simply do not register at lower altitudes. But when the team analyzed the Everest core, the news was not reassuring. The data showed that the South Col Glacier was losing ice at an alarming rate. Accumulated layers representing decades or more of snowfall had thinned dramatically. Sublimation, the process by which ice converts directly to water vapor without melting, was stripping the glacier from the surface down, accelerated by rising temperatures and increasing solar radiation at altitude. Think about what that means. An archive that took centuries to build was being erased in a matter of years. It is not just ice disappearing, it is information disappearing, Every layer that sublimated away took with it data about past climate conditions that can never be recovered. The scientists were not simply studying a glacier, they were racing to read a book before the pages turned to dust. And then there was the plastic. During the same expedition, researchers collected snow samples at multiple elevations on the mountain, including from the area known as the balcony, a small, exposed platform at approximately 8,440 meters. That is roughly 400 vertical meters below the summit. There is almost nowhere higher on the planet's surface. When those samples were analyzed in laboratories using microscopic and spectroscopic techniques, methods capable of identifying synthetic polymers at the level of individual fibers, the results confirmed the presence of microplastics. The dominant particles were fibers consistent with polyester, nylon, and other synthetic materials commonly used in mountaineering clothing, tents, ropes, and equipment. Now, detecting microplastics in snow is not as simple as melting the sample and looking through a magnifying glass. The particles are often smaller than a millimeter. They can resemble natural fibers or mineral grains under ordinary light. Researchers use techniques like Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, which bounces infrared light off a particle and reads the resulting absorption pattern like a chemical fingerprint. Each synthetic polymer produces a distinct signature. Polyester looks different from nylon. Nylon looks different from polypropylene. The identification is precise. But precision creates its own problem: contamination. If your jacket sheds polyester fibers while you are collecting a snow sample at 8,000 meters, you might end up detecting your own clothing rather than environmental pollution. The 2019 team addressed this by using strict contamination protocols: clean suits, pre-washed collection containers, procedural blanks, and laboratory controls designed to distinguish genuine environmental particles from artifacts introduced during sampling or analysis. The microplastics were real. They were in the snow, at 8,400 meters. The likely source is decades of climbing activity. Thousands of expeditions have passed through these elevations. Tents shred in high winds, ropes fray, clothing deteriorates under ultraviolet radiation that is far more intense at altitude than at sea level. Every torn gust of fabric releases fibers. Over time, those fibers accumulate in the snowpack, becoming part of the very ice that scientists drill into for climate records. So here's the contrast that makes this discovery so uncomfortable. One of the most remote, most extreme, most inaccessible environments on Earth turned out to be two things at once: an ancient climate archive preserving atmospheric records from long before the industrial age, and a repository of modern synthetic pollution deposited by the very species trying to study it. The ice remembers what the atmosphere was like centuries ago, and it also remembers every polyester jacket that ever disintegrated on the South Col. What do you think is more unsettling, that the archive is vanishing, or that we have already contaminated the highest frozen record on the planet? Drop your answer in the comments, because this is the kind of question that does not have an easy resolution. Now come down from Everest. Come down a long way, not just in altitude, but in time. Come down about 9 million years. In the foothills south of the main Himalayan range, the landscape changes completely. The enormous peaks give way to lower, eroded ridges and river valleys cutting through soft sedimentary rock. Geologists call these deposits the Sawaliks, a thick sequence of sandstones, mudstones, and conglomerates laid down by ancient rivers over millions of years as the Himalayas rose and eroded simultaneously. The Sawaliks stretch across a wide belt from Pakistan through northern India and into Nepal, and they are among the richest fossil-bearing sediments in southern Asia. At a locality called Tinau Kola, in the Nepalese portion of the Sawalik sequence, paleontologists recovered something small, brown, and worn, an upper molar tooth. It did not belong to a human. It did not belong to any living species. It belonged to a creature called Sivapithecus punjabicus, a large-bodied ape that lived in the forests and woodlands of South Asia during the Miocene epoch. One tooth, that is all. But a single tooth, in the right hands, can carry an enormous amount of information. Paleontologists identify fossil primates from teeth more reliably than from almost any other skeletal element, for a simple reason. Teeth are the hardest structures in the body, the most likely to survive fossilization, and the most diagnostically variable. The size of the crown, the thickness of the enamel, the number and arrangement of the cusps, the shape of the chewing surface, the proportions of the roots, all of these features differ between species in consistent, measurable ways. Civipithecus teeth have a specific pattern. The enamel is thick. The cusps are low and rounded, suited to crushing hard or tough foods. The overall morphology links Civipithecus to the lineage that eventually produced modern orangutans, though the exact branching pattern is still debated. And here is where popular accounts tend to go wrong. Civipithecus was not a human ancestor. It was not a missing link in the human evolutionary story. It was an ape, a genuine, large-bodied, forest-dwelling ape, related to the broader family tree of great apes, but on a branch that leads toward the orangutans of Southeast Asia, not toward humans or African great apes. Calling it a 9-million-year-old human ancestor living in Nepal would be a dramatic headline, but it would also be wrong. What the Tinau Kola tooth actually demonstrated was something different, and, in its own way, just as significant. It expanded the known geographic range of South Asian Miocene hominoids. Before this find, the Civipithecus fossil record was concentrated in Pakistan's Potwar Plateau and parts of northern India. The Nepalese discovery pushed the documented range further east, connecting the Nepalese Sawalik sequence with related faunal assemblages across the subcontinent. It showed that large-bodied apes were not confined to a narrow corridor, but occupied a broader swath of the Himalayan forelands during the late Miocene. Dating the find required a technique suited to deep geological time. You cannot radiocarbon date something 9 million years old. Radiocarbon is only useful for the last 50,000 years or so. Instead, the researchers used paleomagnetic dating. Here is how it works. Earth's magnetic field periodically reverses polarity. Magnetic north becomes magnetic south, and vice versa. These reversals happen at irregular intervals, but they are global events, and each one is recorded in sedimentary and volcanic rocks. As sediment is deposited and compacted, tiny magnetic minerals within it align with the ambient magnetic field, preserving a record of the polarity at the time of deposition. By sampling a vertical sequence of rock and measuring the polarity of each layer, geologists can construct a local magnetic polarity stratigraphy. Then, they match it against the global geomagnetic polarity timescale, a reference chart built from radiometrically dated volcanic rocks around the world. The Tinau Kola section produced a clear paleomagnetic signal. The fossil-bearing layer fell within a reversed polarity interval that corresponds to an age of approximately 9 to 9.5 million years. One tooth, a few millimeters of enamel and dentin preserved in river sediment. And from that single object, researchers extracted the identity of the animal, its dietary adaptations, its evolutionary relationships, its geographic range, and the age of the rock that held it. There is a kind of beauty in that economy. The Himalayas are famous for their scale, the tallest peaks, the deepest gorges, the most massive geological forces on the planet. But some of the most important evidence those mountains have ever produced fits in the palm of your hand. Now go forward in time. Skip past the Miocene. Skip past the Pleistocene. Come forward to roughly 2,500 years ago, and climb back up, this time to 4,000 meters, into the dry, cold valleys of Upper Mustang. Upper Mustang sits in northern Nepal, just south of the Tibetan Plateau. The landscape is desert, rainfall is minimal, wind is constant. Temperatures swing wildly between day and night. Vegetation is sparse. The valley walls are carved from soft, sedimentary rock, sandstone and conglomerate, riddled with natural cavities and honeycombed with caves, some of them cut or expanded by human hands. In 1995, archaeologists investigating the Mebrak cave system made a discovery that no one had expected at that altitude. Inside a burial chamber carved into the cliff face, they found approximately 30 naturally mummified individuals placed in painted wooden coffins. The burials dated from around 400 BC to the beginning of the Common Era, a span of roughly 4 centuries. Natural mummification, not deliberate embalming, not ritual preservation. The environment itself did the work. At 4,000 meters, the air is thin, dry, and cold. Humidity is extremely low, especially inside enclosed cave chambers sheltered from rain and snowmelt. In those conditions, a human body can desiccate before bacterial decomposition has time to destroy soft tissue. The result is preservation. Skin, hair, muscle, and internal organs survive in a state that would be impossible at lower, warmer, wetter elevations. It is the same principle that preserves freeze-dried food, scaled up to an entire human corpse. And it is not just bodies that survive. The dry cold preserves organic materials that almost never last in the archaeological record: wood, leather, textiles, rope, pigment on coffin surfaces, plant remains used as offerings or bedding. These are the kinds of evidence that rot away within years or decades at most lowland sites. At 4,000 meters in Upper Mustang, they endure for millennia. Then came the discoveries at Samzong. Further up the valley system, at a site accessible only by climbing exposed cliff faces, archaeologists excavated shaft tombs cut vertically into the rock. These burials dated somewhat later, roughly the 5th to 7th centuries AD, and the grave goods were extraordinary. Painted coffins again, but now accompanied by iron weapons, copper vessels, glass beads, and, most strikingly, gold and silver funerary masks. The masks were placed over the faces of the dead, thin sheets of precious metal, shaped and sometimes incised with simple features. Do not imagine Egyptian-style death masks with elaborate portraits. These were different, more abstract, more stylized, and in some ways more mysterious precisely because they do not belong to any well-known artistic tradition. They are not Tibetan, they are not Indian, they are not Chinese. They represent a local funerary culture that flourished at extreme altitude and then disappeared, leaving almost no written record of its own. The metal objects are where the story becomes much larger than one valley. Chemical and isotopic analyses of the metals, techniques like lead isotope analysis and trace element profiling, allow researchers to compare the composition of an artifact with the geochemical signatures of known ore sources across Asia. Different mining regions produce metals with different isotopic ratios, essentially a geological fingerprint. When you find a copper vessel in a cave at 4,000 meters and its isotopic signature matches ore deposits hundreds or thousands of kilometers away, you have evidence of long-distance exchange. And that is exactly what the analyses revealed. The metals and materials found in Upper Mustang showed connections with South Asia, Central Asia, and networks comparable in scope to the wider Silk Road system. Glass beads matched compositions known from distant production centers. Copper alloys carried signatures inconsistent with local geology. These were not isolated mountain people making do with whatever they could find in the valley. They were participants in continental-scale trade, receiving, and possibly sending, goods across enormous distances. At 4,000 meters, in caves accessible only by climbing crumbling sandstone cliffs. If you had been asked before these excavations whether a community living at that altitude could have been connected to Central Asian trade routes, most people, including many scholars, would have hesitated. The assumption was isolation. High mountains equal barriers. Remote valleys equal cut-off communities. The Upper Mustang burials shattered that assumption with physical evidence that cannot be argued away. But the genetics told a more complicated story. Ancient DNA extracted from individuals buried at Chokopani, Mebrok, and Samzong, spanning roughly 1,000 years of burials, revealed strong East Asian ancestry and long-term genetic continuity among the high-altitude populations. These were not transient groups passing through. They were established communities, genetically stable over centuries, deeply rooted in the region. So here's the tension that makes Upper Mustang so important. The genetics say continuity and deep local roots. The grave goods say long-distance connections across Asia. Both are true simultaneously. The people of Upper Mustang were not isolated hermits, and they were not cosmopolitan migrants constantly mixing with distant populations. They were a stable, locally rooted community that nonetheless participated in exchange networks stretching across the continent. That combination, genetic continuity plus material connectivity, is one of the most important patterns that modern bioarchaeology has identified in high-altitude populations, and Upper Mustang is one of the clearest cases anywhere in the world. If you find this kind of mystery compelling, the kind where real evidence overturns comfortable assumptions and every answer opens 3 more questions, then subscribe to the channel, because Nepal's mountains are full of things that the usual story never mentions, and we are only getting started. Now come down from the high valleys. Come west, into the remote interior of Nepal's Karnali region, to a place that most travelers, even most Nepalis, have never visited. The Sinja Valley sits in the district of Jumla, in the far northwest of the country. To reach it today requires either a difficult overland journey through mountain roads that are frequently impassable, or a flight to one of Nepal's more precarious rural airstrips, followed by a trek on foot. The valley itself is high, roughly 2,300 meters, but not as extreme as Upper Mustang. It is green in summer, snow-covered in winter, and almost completely absent from the usual circuits of tourism or international attention. And yet, between roughly the 12th and 14th centuries, this valley was the seat of a kingdom. The Khasa Kingdom, sometimes called the Western Mala Kingdom, was a powerful state that controlled significant portions of the western Himalayas. Its rulers issued inscriptions, minted coins, administered territory, collected revenue, and projected power across a region that today spans parts of Nepal, northwestern India, and possibly portions of western Tibet. For approximately 2 centuries, the Khasa kings were major political players in the Himalayan world. Their capital was at Sinja. Archaeological research in the valley has documented the physical remains of that capital, ruins of palaces and temples, settlement areas with visible foundation walls, gateways and stairways cut into the hillside, and, most strikingly, a ring of massive monolithic stone pillars, tall, single-block columns erected in an arrangement that suggests a ceremonial or administrative precinct. Across the Hima River from the main settlement area, caves preserve Buddhist chaityas, small stupas carved in relief, and inscriptions cut directly into the rock face. These inscriptions are crucial evidence. Some of them are among the earliest written documents connected with the development of the Nepali language. That last point deserves emphasis. The Nepali language as it exists today, the national language of Nepal, spoken by millions, traces part of its literary and documentary ancestry to inscriptions found in this remote valley. Linguists and historians use these carved texts to study how the language evolved, how its script developed, and how political identity was expressed in written form during the medieval period. Sinja is not just an archaeological site, it is a linguistic origin point. The infrastructure of the capital reveals more than simply the presence of buildings. Underground clay water pipes have been documented in the settlement area, a planned system for moving or managing water through the town. At 2,300 meters, in a valley with harsh winters and limited flat terrain, the construction of a piped water system represents a significant investment of labor, planning, and engineering knowledge. The monolithic pillars, the palace ruins, the gateways, the carved inscriptions, the water pipes, taken together, they describe a settlement that was far more than a cluster of mountain villages. This was an administered capital, with monumental architecture, religious infrastructure, written governance, and planned urban services. And almost nobody outside specialist Himalayan studies has heard of it. Why? Partly because the Khasa kingdom fell. By the 14th century, the kingdom had fragmented. Its successor states were absorbed into other political entities. The capital at Sinja was abandoned or reduced to a minor settlement. The valley returned to the kind of quiet obscurity that remote Himalayan locations tend to fall into when political power moves elsewhere. But the ruins remain, the pillars still stand, the inscriptions are still legible, the water pipes are still in the ground. Sinja is a reminder that remoteness and insignificance are not the same thing. A place can be extremely difficult to reach and still have been, at one point in history, the center of a powerful and sophisticated state. Now leave the mountains entirely, come south, into the flat, humid, subtropical lowlands of Nepal's Terai, the strip of plains along the Indian border that could not be more different from the high valleys and frozen peaks. And here, beneath ordinary agricultural fields, lies one of the most complete ancient city plans ever detected in South Asia. Tilorakot is located in the Rupandehi district, near the town of Talihawa. The site has been known to archaeologists for well over a century. Brick walls, earthen ramparts, and surface pottery had long indicated the presence of an ancient settlement. But for most of that time, the site was understood in fragments. A wall here, a gate there, a section of moat, a scatter of pottery. No one had a clear picture of how big the city was, how it was organized, or what lay beneath the surface between the exposed features. That changed with modern geophysics. In a series of campaigns, researchers deployed magnetometry, a technique that measures tiny variations in the magnetic field at or just below the ground surface. The principle is straightforward, even if the execution is technically demanding. Fired materials, bricks, kiln debris, hearths, burned structures, acquire a permanent magnetic signature when they cool from high temperatures. Ditches and pits filled with different soil also produce magnetic contrasts against the surrounding natural ground. A magnetometer, carried systematically across a site in a grid pattern, records these subtle variations and produces a map of subsurface anomalies. The result, when the data were processed, was extraordinary. Almost the complete plan of the buried city emerged from the readings. Fortifications enclosing a roughly rectangular area, gateways positioned at cardinal points, streets running in an organized grid pattern, urban blocks, distinct zones of dense structural remains separated by open spaces that probably represent roads or lanes, and a large enclosed central complex, possibly a palace or administrative precinct, sitting at the heart of the settlement. UNESCO described the resulting plan as one of the most complete layouts known for an early historic city in South Asia. Not one of the best preserved, the structures are still largely underground. One of the most complete in terms of the legibility of the urban design. The instruments essentially developed the city the way a darkroom develops a photograph. The information was always there, encoded in magnetic variations beneath rice paddies and scrub. It just needed the right tool to make it visible. Later excavations at targeted locations confirmed that the geophysical anomalies corresponded to real structural remains. Walls were where the magnetometer said walls should be. Ditches were where the data predicted ditches. The alignment of streets, the position of gates, and the scale of the central precinct all held up when tested against the spade. The fortifications deserve specific mention. The city was enclosed by a substantial defensive system. Walls, ramparts, and a probable moat. The gates were formal, constructed entrances, not gaps in a fence. The scale of the defenses and the regularity of the street plan point clearly to deliberate urban planning. This was not a settlement that grew organically over centuries until someone decided to build a wall around it. The layout shows intentional design from an early stage. Tilaurakot is also the main Nepalese candidate for ancient Kapilavastu, the capital of the Shakya clan, the ruling family into which, according to Buddhist tradition, Siddhartha Gautama was born before becoming the Buddha. If the identification is correct, the geophysical plan may represent the actual city where one of the most influential figures in human history spent his early years. But that identification remains a matter of scholarly debate. An alternative site across the border in India, Piprawa, has also been proposed as Kapilavastu, and the question has never been fully resolved to everyone's satisfaction. The evidence on both sides includes archaeology, epigraphy, and the accounts of ancient Chinese pilgrims who visited the region. Serious scholars hold positions on both sides. What is not debated is the quality of the urban plan revealed at Tilaurakot. Whatever its ancient name was, the site preserves the readable ghost of a fortified, planned city from the early historic period. A city that was literally invisible from the surface until magnetometry pulled its streets and walls out of the magnetic noise beneath the soil. It is the kind of discovery that changes how you look at a landscape. Next time you walk across an ordinary field in the Gangetic Plains, remember that there might be an entire city underneath your feet, waiting for the right instrument to see it. Now come back into the Kathmandu Valley, into the dense, layered, earthquake-prone heart of Nepal's capital. Kastamandap was one of Kathmandu's most famous historical monuments, a large, pagoda-roofed public shelter that sat in Durbar Square, the ceremonial center of the old city. The name Kathmandu itself is widely believed to derive from Kastamandap, meaning roughly wood shelter or wood pavilion. For centuries, the building was understood through documentary sources, inscriptions, chronicles, and historical references that placed its construction in the early medieval period, perhaps around the 12th century AD. Then, on April 25, 2015, a magnitude 7.8 earthquake struck central Nepal. The shaking was catastrophic. Across the Kathmandu Valley, ancient temples collapsed, towers fell, and historical structures that had survived centuries of seismicity were reduced to rubble in seconds. Kastamandap was among the casualties. The building pancaked. Its upper stories and roof came down, leaving a field of shattered timber, brick debris, and broken carved elements. The destruction was devastating, but it created an opportunity that had never existed before. With the superstructure gone, archaeologists could for the first time examine the building's foundations, structural layers that had been hidden beneath floors, platforms, and accumulated construction for as long as the monument had stood. Previous researchers had never been able to reach these levels without dismantling a revered, functioning public building. The earthquake, horribly, did the dismantling for them. What they found underneath pushed the history of the site back dramatically. Using optically stimulated luminescence dating, a technique we need to explain properly because it is central to this discovery, researchers determined that the earliest foundation materials dated to approximately AD 700. Optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL, works on a fundamentally different principle from radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon measures the decay of carbon-14 in organic materials, wood, bone, charcoal. OSL measures something else entirely: the accumulated radiation damage in mineral grains, specifically quartz and feldspar. Here is the logic. When a mineral grain is exposed to sunlight, its crystal structure is effectively reset. Trapped electrons are released, and the luminescence clock goes back to zero. Once that grain is buried, sealed beneath a floor, packed into a foundation, covered by construction, it begins accumulating electrons again, trapped by defects in the crystal lattice, as the grain absorbs low-level natural radiation from the surrounding soil. The longer the grain stays buried, the more trapped electrons accumulate. In the laboratory, researchers stimulate the grain with light and measure the luminescence it emits. The brighter the signal, the longer the grain has been buried since its last exposure to sunlight. OSL is particularly useful when there is no organic material to radiocarbon date, when you are dealing with mortar, brick, sediment fills, or earthen foundations where wood and charcoal are absent or unreliable. At Kastamandap, the technique allowed researchers to date the construction events themselves, not just associated organic debris. The result, approximately AD 700, placed the earliest foundations roughly 400 to 500 years before the first known documentary references to the building. The written record, which scholars had relied on for centuries, turned out to capture only the later history of a structure whose origins were far older. That alone would be a significant finding, but there was more. When engineers and archaeologists examined the exposed foundation system, they noticed something that demanded explanation. The foundations had survived. Not just survived the 2015 earthquake, but apparently survived multiple previous seismic events over more than a millennium. The catastrophic failure in 2015 occurred in the upper structure, the timber frame, the walls, the roof. The ancient stone and brick platform beneath had remained substantially intact. Researchers began studying the foundation design as possible evidence of early earthquake-resistant construction practice in the Kathmandu Valley. The foundation system incorporated features, flexible jointing, specific material layering, load distribution geometry, that may have allowed it to absorb and dissipate seismic energy rather than concentrating stress at failure points. Now, a critical distinction. This does not mean that 7th century builders in the Kathmandu Valley possessed modern seismic engineering theory. They did not have accelerometers, finite element analysis software, or building codes based on spectral response. What they may have had was accumulated practical knowledge, generations of experience building in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth, knowledge passed from master builders to apprentices, encoded not in equations but in craft tradition. Build the base this way, with these materials, in this configuration, because buildings made this way survive the shaking. It is engineering by observation and tradition, not by calculation, and the 2015 earthquake provided brutal, unplanned confirmation that the tradition worked, at least at the foundation level. The irony is almost painful. The earthquake that destroyed Kastamandap also proved that its hidden foundations were both older and tougher than the visible monument. The part of the building that everyone knew, the carved wooden pavilion, the pagoda roofs, the cultural landmark, collapsed. The part that nobody had ever seen, the buried 7th century platform beneath, held. Share this video with someone who is fascinated by how disasters can accidentally reveal things that centuries of peaceful scholarship never found. Because that is exactly what happened here. An earthquake destroyed a monument and exposed a mystery that had been waiting, silent, beneath the floor for 1,300 years. Now step back and look at what we have covered. Near the summit of Everest, scientists found both a disappearing climate archive and modern synthetic pollution lodged in snow that most people imagine as pristine. In the foothill sediments of the Siwaliks, a single tooth proved that large-bodied apes occupied the Himalayan forelands 9 million years ago. In the caves of Upper Mustang, Mummies and gold masks told a story of communities that were simultaneously deeply rooted and globally connected. In the remote Sinja Valley, the ruins of a forgotten capital preserved evidence of a medieval kingdom that shaped language, administered territory, and engineered water systems at altitude. Beneath the fields of the Tarai, magnetometry revealed an entire planned city, streets, gates, fortifications, central precinct that had been invisible from the surface. And in the rubble of the 2015 earthquake, foundations emerged that were 5 centuries older and structurally stronger than the building that collapsed on top of them. 6 discoveries, 6 completely different kinds of evidence: fossil teeth and ice cores, gold masks and clay water pipes, magnetic anomalies and luminescence dating, genetics and geophysics, paleontology and pollution, and all of them from the same narrow strip of land wedged between the Tibetan Plateau and the Gangetic Plain. Nepal is not a footnote in the human story. It is not a scenic backdrop for mountaineering documentaries. It is a place where the evidence, the physical, testable, datable, analyzable evidence, keeps forcing us to redraw maps, push back timelines, and abandon comfortable assumptions about what was possible, where, and when. The caves are still full of bodies no one has excavated. The Shawaliks are still releasing fossils. The fields of the Tarai almost certainly hide more cities. The ice on Everest is still melting, still losing data, still accumulating plastic. And somewhere in a remote valley in the far west, a line of stone pillars stands in tall grass, waiting for someone to come back and finish the story. The mountains remember. The question is whether we are paying attention.